Hi everybody, this is Agnes from No Sediment, and today let's taste different vintages of the same wine. I have prepared a beautiful vertical for today's tasting. 4 completely different Barolo vintages coming from a single vineyard. I hope you are just as excited as I am. We all know that vintage matters, especially if we are planning to age our wine in the cellars. Wine is considered to be a food, and yet we don't see the expiration date on the bottles, although I think some wines could use best before date. For us, the wine lovers, vintage serves exactly this purpose. When looking for wines that are best enjoyed fresh and young, we seek out the most recent vintage. I know I will stay away from majority of pink wines that are older than 3 or 4 years. And yet, for some white and red wines, and even some pink wines, vintage does matter, because it shapes the wine. With that in mind, some vintages have proven to produce better quality wines that age longer and more gracefully than other vintages. As we dive deep enough into the wine world and educate ourselves, we get to know better the vintages of our favorite winemaking regions. Consequently, we gain a better understanding of which wines to buy, which wines to cellar, and which wines to take out of our cellars and pop open. But we have tasting to do, therefore I don't want to take up too much time talking about how important vintages are. For that, you might want to watch my other video on why vintage matters, link in the description and here. Vintage variation can truly be appreciated when tasting verticals. In the perfect world, tasting wines from one winery and a single vineyard site will reflect the differences between vintages the best. Tasting monovarietal wines, meaning wines from a single grape variety, would also help, because oftentimes winemakers can adjust the shortcomings of the harvest by blending. And it rarely ever happens, but we actually do live in a perfect world, because Enrico Rivetto, a winemaker from Barolo, has shared with me a beautiful vertical of his single vineyard Bricolina Barolos. All 4 wines come from different vintages, and Barolo is one of those regions where vintage can have a significant impact on the wine. And the vintages we have today are 2010, an exceptional vintage with close to ideal weather, featuring a long and cool growing season, which resulted in age-worthy, elegant and balanced wines. 2014, a difficult vintage with cool and rainy weather, small yields and delayed harvest. 2017, a hot and relatively dry vintage with an early harvest and potentially early appeal. And 2018, a recent vintage that started cool but continued with warm temperatures and abundant rain. So let's finally taste and see how different characteristics of each vintage reflect in wine and its ability to withstand the test of time. These wines were poured by my cameraman, so I don't know which wine is which. Wine number 1. It shows a lot of fresh cherries, raspberries, strawberries. It is very inviting on the nose. But it also has that kind of hint of herbs and maybe like floral characteristic. It is really, really inviting. It kind of tells you, please enjoy me, drink me. And I will. This is the first wine that I tasted, and naturally it seems high in acidity, but this is Nebbiolo grape, and Nebbiolo grape shows typically high elevated acidity and high levels of tannins. But I would say that they are firm and they are quite beautifully shaped. They're not aggressive or robust or harsh in any way. And of course, for other wines, it would make sense to pay a lot of attention to the color, but here Nebbiolo tends to have a lot of brownish and brick color already in its youth, so it is very difficult to say. Therefore, I will not base my conclusions on the color for Nebbiolo grape. It would be completely different if I would be tasting Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon. But overall, I would say that this wine shows a lot of primary and secondary aromas, which are from the grape itself and the winemaking technique, but very little tertiary characteristics which come with age. So I would say that this is one of the recent vintages, maybe 17 or 18. So wine number 2. Okay, so this wine, it shows more dried fruit characteristics. It shows dried cherries, dried lilac, some like leathery hints, and maybe some forest floor and autumn leaves. And these notes actually come from aging. This wine doesn't seem tired in any way, but it does show some development on the nose. So based on the nose alone, I would maybe move away from the younger vintages or later vintages. I really like this nose. This is why I like Nebbiolo. It develops so beautifully with age. Let's taste it. This wine is marked by acidity. As I told you before, Nebbiolo shows high acidity, but this wine, the acidity is mouth-watering. It shapes the wine, it defines the wine. The tannins are more angular, they are a bit stickier to the palate. I think it's a beautiful wine, and I really do enjoy it. And it's a fresher style. I mean, the acidity is definitely higher than for the wine number one. It is still too early for me to come to conclusions, but I would like to say that this definitely is one of the older vintages, wine number two, because it does show that tertiary flavors on the nose and the palate. Wine number three. This smells like coffee bean dipped in a chocolate. And there's a lot of leathery notes, you know, even some animalistic elements like horse, barnyard. But I mean, sometimes people will associate barnyard with Brettanomyces, which I don't think this is. This is just this beautiful, quite clean, animalistic hints that for me also comes with age. I mean, with development in the bottle. So right from the top of my head, I would also say that this is older vintage, but it is just so complex. I mean, like black earth and truffly notes. It's just so lovely. There's some toastiness, some hazelnuts. Yeah. You know, and Nebbiolo is never the most fruitier grape variety. So even though it does show some, you know, fruit characteristics, but at this level, they are kind of playing a supporting role. Let's taste it. This is wine that you kind of want to have maybe a second sip. It was really beautifully balanced on the palate. Yeah, I mean, the acidity, of course, is elevated, it is mouth-watering, but it is beautifully balanced with the fruit. The tannin, it is firm, but it is in a harmony. And aftertaste is also quite lovely. A bit earthy, yes, not as fruit-driven, maybe just, you know, some hints here and there with some dried cherries, but it is still on the palate, and it's not the acidity alone, or it's not the tannin alone. And as I told you, this wine did show that development on the nose and on the palate. So I would say that this is also one of the older vintages. So let's move to wine number four. So this wine shows quite prominent, intense, expressive nose, and there's a lot of toastiness. Alcohol is quite prominent for this wine. It is warming, but the fruit was kind of hidden. So I would say that this is closed wine still, and the alcohol is elevated. Acidity is, yes, it is lovely, it is beautiful, it is refreshing overall, the wine, but it is not defining. I would like to say that wine number one and wine number four come from the recent vintages. And I do think that wine number four showed more prominent alcohol level and maybe not as fresh and zesty acidity. Therefore, I would want to say that this is 2017, which was hot and dry vintage. And then wine number one would be 2018. As for wines number two and three, they definitely show some development that has happened probably in the bottle. So there's a lot of tertiary notes. I would say that the most tertiary notes showed wine number three, but it was also the most balanced, the most harmonious, and I really did enjoy it. I mean, the tannins were lovely integrated, the acidity was there, but it was like a whole wine, you know? I would expect wine number three to come from a very good vintage at least, so that would be the 2010 vintage, and then wine number two would be 2014, which was relatively cool and rainy. It did have a very prominent and expressive acidity, and that would kind of make sense to have higher acidity levels in the wines that are coming from a cooler vintages. Let's reveal the wines, shall we? So wine number one, I said this is 2018. Oh, no, it's... I'm wrong. I started out with the first wine and I'm wrong. So this is 2017 vintage. So this was the hot and dry vintage. Actually, it is quite beautiful. I really did like it. I mean, it is always nice to drink older vintages. It shows a lot of characteristic wine can have, but I really did enjoy this wine. As I told you, it was very inviting. So 2017, good for you. So wine number 2, I'm afraid now to continue. Maybe I've gone completely wrong. So wine number 2, I told it was a cool vintage, rainy vintage, 2014. Let's reveal. Oh, whew. It is 2014. Yes, I mean, you kind of would expect maybe less body, less alcohol, even though this is 14, higher acidity, maybe firmer, harsher, more biting tannin structure, and this had exactly that. But it was still developing quite beautifully, and I think it could live for another 10 years for sure in the bottle. So yeah, wine number 3. So I told that this wine was the most harmonious and this was a really beautiful bottle. I would expect it to be 2010. Yes, let's reveal it. All right, and it is 2010. Lucky me. Beautiful, beautiful wine. I think it can age for another 10 years for sure, but it is drinking nicely right now. I mean, it had everything you would wish in a developed, beautiful wine. Beautiful tannin, firm but kind of developed and resolved, elevated, well-balanced, integrated acidity. Yes, lovely wine. That will be my wine for tonight. And now I know the wine number 4 is the vintage 2018. Interesting. But I think 2018 was also relatively hot, no? This is where I made my mistake. One more theory thing. I think that sometimes with age, specific characteristics of each vintage might be easier to pinpoint rather in young vintages, because in young vintages they all are still, you know, fresh, bright, expressive, full of fruit. They kind of start on the same path, and then with age they would move, you know, in the different directions. I'm sorry, I don't want to make excuses, but yes, I think it is difficult at the very beginning to differentiate the vintages and their characteristics in wine. So here you go. These are the 4 different vintages that we have tasted today. I want to say this though, winemaker does matter a lot, and especially so in the bad vintages. I mean, everyone can make a beautiful wine in a perfect vintage. It just, nature helps you to shape the wine and everything just goes smoothly and it's beautiful. But when the vintage is difficult and it's rainy and there's disease pressure, I mean, this is when winemaker can show its mastery. Yeah, and therefore I think the reason why I like 2017 vintage is because lately the cool and rainy vintages are not a big problem anymore. The most difficult vintages are those that are hot and dry, and if the winemaker can manage their alcohol content, if the winemaker can manage that grapes are not, or wines are not stressed, and create this really beautiful and balanced wine, it reflects in the wine. And I mean, it showed here. I really did enjoy 2017. It did not show that it is coming from a hot vintage. So I think that is a point to a winemaker. Speaking about the winemaker, by the way, this is done by Enrico Rivetto, and I recently published my very first podcast episode on No Sediment YouTube channel. He is the first and currently the only one biodynamically certified winemaker in Barolo, and on that podcast we talked about the challenges of biodynamic winemaking. Here is the link and you might want to check it out. Thank you for watching, and if you want to know how price reflects on the wine's quality, make sure to watch this video.